William Shakespeare. 1. Youth, 1564 to 85. Let us, for the adequacy of this record, summarize what half the world knows about Shakespeare. Now that devout scholarship has rummaged among his relics for 3 centuries, it is remarkable how much we do know, far more than enough to set aside as not meriting debate all doubts about his authorship of nearly all the plays ascribed to his name. However, we are not sure about his name. Elizabeth allowed more freedom of spelling than of religion. The same document might use different spellings of the same word, and a man might sign his name variously according to his haste or mood. So contemporaries wrote Marlowe as Marlowe, M-A-R-L-O, Marlin, Marley, Morley. And Shakespeare's 6 surviving signatures all offer different spellings of his last name. The now prevalent spelling has no warrant in his autographs. 3 different signatures are all on the same will. His mother was Mary Arden, of an old Warwickshire family. She brought to John Shakespeare, son of her father's tenant, a goodly dowry in cash and land, and gave him 8 children, of whom William was the 3rd. John became a prosperous businessman in Stratford-upon-Avon, bought 2 houses, served his town as ale-taster, constable, alderman, and bailiff, and contributed liberally to the poor. After 1572, his fortunes fell. He was sued for £30, he failed to answer, and an order was issued for his arrest. In 1580, for reasons unknown, he was required by the court to give security against a breach of the peace. In 1592, he was listed as not coming monthly to church according to Her Majesty's laws. Some have concluded from this that he was a recusant Catholic, others that he was a Puritan, others that he dared not face his creditors. William later restored his father's finances, and when the father died, 1601, 2 houses in Henley Street remained in the Shakespeare name. The Stratford Parish Church registered William's baptism on April 26, 1564. Nicholas Rowe, his first biographer, recorded in 1709 the Stratford tradition, now generally credited, that the father bred him for some time at a free school, but the narrowness of his circumstances and the want of his assistance at home forced his father to withdraw him from thence. Ben Jonson, in the elegy prefixed to the first folio edition of the plays, addressed his dead rival, "Thou hadst small Latin and less Greek." Apparently the Greek dramatists remained Greek to Shakespeare, but he learned enough Latin to clutter his lesser plays with Latin odds and ends and bilingual puns. If he had learned more, he might have become another scholar, laborious and unknown. London was to be his school. Another tradition, recorded by Richard Davis about 1681, described young William as much given to all unluckiness in stealing venison and rabbits, particularly from Sir Thomas Lucy, who had him oft whipped and sometimes imprisoned. On November 27, 1582, when said miscreant was 18, he and Anne Hathaway, then about 25, obtained a marriage license. Circumstances indicate that Anne's friends compelled Shakespeare to marry her. In May 1583, 6 months after the marriage, a daughter was born to them, whom they named Susanna. Later, Anne presented the poet with twins, who were christened Hamnet and Judith, on February 2, 1585. Probably toward the end of that year, Shakespeare left his wife and children. We have no record of him between 1585 and 1592, when we find him an actor in London. 2. Development, 1592 to 95. The first reference to him there is uncomplimentary. On September 3, 1592, Robert Greene issued from his deathbed a warning to his friends that they were being displaced in the London theatre by an upstart crow, beautified with our feathers, that with his tiger's heart wrapped in a player's hide, parody of a line from Part 3 of Henry VI, supposes he is as well able to bombast out a blank verse as the best of you, and being an absolute Johannes factotum, is in his own conceit the only shake scene in a country. This morsel was prepared for the press as part of Green's Groat's Worth of Wit by Henry Chettle, who in a later epistle offered an apology to one of the two persons, probably Marlowe and Shakespeare, who had been attacked by Green. With neither of them that take offence was I acquainted, and with one of them I care not if I never be. As to the other, I am sorry, because myself have seen his demeanour no less civil than he was excellent in the quality, calling, he professes. Besides, divers of worship have reported his uprightness of dealing, which argues his honesty, and his facetious, agreeable grace in writing that approves his art. There seems no doubt that Green's attack and Chettle's apology referred to Shakespeare. By 1592, then, the former poacher of Stratford had become an actor and playwright in the capital. Dowdall, 1693, and Rowe, 1709, related that he was received into the playhouse as a servitor in a very mean rank, which is probable. But he fretted with ambition, desiring this man's art and that man's scope, with not a thought but turned on dignity. Soon he was acting minor parts, making himself a motley to the view. Then he played the kindly Adam in As You Like It and the Ghost in Hamlet. Probably he rose to higher roles, for his name headed the list of actors in Jonson's Every Man in His Humour, 1598, and in Jonson's Sejanus, 1604, he and Richard Burbage were specified as the principal tragedians. By the end of 1594, he was a shareholder in the Chamberlain's Company of Players. It was not as a dramatist, but as an actor and shareholder in a theatrical company, that Shakespeare made his fortune. However, by 1591, he was writing plays. He seems to have begun as a play doctor, editing, touching up, and adapting manuscripts for his company. From such work he passed to collaboration. The three parts of Henry VI, 1592, appear to have been such a composite production. Thereafter he wrote plays at the rate of almost 2 per year, 36 or 38 in all. Several early ones, A Comedy of Errors, 1592, Two Gentlemen of Verona, 1594, and Love's Labour's Lost, 1594, are light-hearted trifles, frothy with now tiresome badinage. It is instructive to see that Shakespeare had to grow into greatness by hard work. But the growth was rapid. Taking a hint from Marlowe's Edward II, he found in English history many a dramatic theme. Richard II, 1595, equaled the earlier play. Richard III, 1592, had already surpassed it. In some measure he fell into the fault of making a whole man out of one quality, the hunchback king out of treacherous and murderous ambition. But he lifted the play now and then out of Marlowe's reach by depth of analysis, intensity of feeling, and flashes of brilliant phrase. Soon, a horse, my kingdom for a horse, was a London cliché. Then in Titus Andronicus, 1593, genius flagged. Imitation took the lead and presented a repulsive dance of death. Titus kills his son, and others kill his son-in-law on the stage. A bride, raped behind the scenes, comes on the boards with her hands cut off, her tongue cut out, her mouth bubbling blood. A traitor chops off Titus's hand before the groundling's avid eyes. The severed heads of 2 of Titus's sons are displayed. A nurse is killed on stage. Reverent critics have labored to burden collaborators with part or all of the responsibility for this slaughter, on the mistaken theory that Shakespeare could not write nonsense. He wrote reams of it. It was at about this point in his development that he composed his narrative poems and his sonnets. Perhaps the plague that caused the closing of all London theatres between 1592 and 1594 left him with penurious leisure, and he thought it advisable to cast a hopeful line to some patron of poetry. In 1593 he dedicated Venus and Adonis to Henry Wriothesley, 3rd Earl of Southampton. Lodge had adapted the tale from Ovid's Metamorphoses. Shakespeare adapted it from Lodge. The Earl was young, handsome, and addicted to venery. Perhaps the poem was spiced to his taste. Much of it seems jejune to jaded years, but in this proliferated seduction there are passages of sensuous beauty, for example, lines 679 to 708, such as England had rarely read before. Encouraged by public applause and a gift from Southampton, Shakespeare issued in 1594 The Ravishment of Lucrece, where the seduction was accomplished with a greater economy of verse. This was the last of his voluntary publications. About 1593 he began to write, but kept from the press, the sonnets that first established his preeminence among the poets of his time. Technically the most nearly perfect of Shakespeare's works, they borrow heavily from the Petrarchan treasury of sonnet themes, the transitory beauty of the beloved, her cruel hesitations and inconstancy, the dreary crawl of unused time, the jealousies and the panting thirst of the lover, and the poet's boast that in his rhymes the lady's loveliness and fame would shine forever. Even some phrases and epithets are appropriated from Constable, Daniel, Watson, and other sonneteers, who themselves were links in a chain of pilferings. No one has succeeded in arranging the sonnets in any consistent narrative order. They were the casual labor of scattered days. We must not take too seriously their hazy plot, the love of the poet for a young man, his passion for a dark lady of the court, her rejection of him and acceptance of his friend, the winning of that friend by a rival poet, and Shakespeare's despairing dalliance with thoughts of death. It is possible that Shakespeare, acting before the court, cast looks of distant longing at the Queen's ladies-in-waiting, so intoxicatingly perfumed and gowned. It is unlikely that he ever spoke to them or followed the scent to the prey. One such lady, Mary Fitton, became the mistress of the Earl of Pembroke. She appears to have been blonde, but this may have been merely a passing dye. However, she was unmarried, whereas Shakespeare's lady broke her bed vow in loving the poet and his boy. In 1609, Thomas Thorpe published the sonnets, apparently without Shakespeare's consent. As the author supplied no dedication, Thorpe provided one, to the puzzlement of centuries. To the only begetter of these ensuing sonnets, Mr. W.H., all happiness and that eternity promised by our ever-living poet, wisheth the well-wishing adventurer in setting forth. The signature, T.T., presumably meant Thomas Thorpe. But who was W.H.? The initials might mean William Herbert, 3rd Earl of Pembroke, who had seduced Mary Fitton, and was destined, with his brother Philip, to receive the dedication of the posthumous First Folio as the greatest Maecenas to learned men of any peer of his time or since. Herbert was only 13 when the sonnets began, 1593, but their composition extended to 1598, by which time Pembroke was ripe for love and patronage. The poet speaks ardently of his love for the boy. Love was then often used for friendship. But Sonnet 20 calls the lad the master-mistress of my passion, and ends with an erotic play on words, and Sonnet 128, apparently addressed to the lovely boy of 126, talks of amorous ecstasy. Some Elizabethan poets were literary pederasts, capable of winding themselves up to rapturous love for any man of means. The important point about the sonnets is not their story, but their beauty. Many of them, for example, 29, 30, 33, 55, 64, 66, 71, 97, 106, 117, are rich in lines whose depth of thought, warmth of feeling, glow of imagery, or grace of phrase has made them ring for centuries through the English-speaking world. 3. Mastery, 1595 to 1608. But the artifices and restraint of the sonnet clipped the wings of fancy, and Shakespeare must have rejoiced in the fluent freedom of blank verse when, still young and ardent, he let himself go in one of the great love poems of all time. The story of Romeo and Juliet came to England from the novelle of Masuccio and Bandello. Arthur Brooke rephrased it in narrative verse, 1562, and Shakespeare, following Brooke and perhaps an earlier play on the subject, staged his Romeo and Juliet about 1595. The style is cloyed with conceits that may have clung to his pen from his sonneteering. The metaphors run wild. Romeo is weakly drawn beside the effervescent Mercutio, and the denouement is a concatenation of absurdities. But who that remembers youth, or has a dream left in his soul, can hear that honeyed music of romance without jettisoning all canons of credibility and rising breathless at the poet's bidding into this world of precipitate ardor, trembling solicitude, and melodious death? Almost yearly now, Shakespeare won a dramatic victory. On June 7, 1594, Elizabeth's Jewish physician, Rodrigo Lopez, was executed on the charge of having accepted a bribe to poison the Queen. The evidence was inconclusive, and Elizabeth long hesitated to sign the death warrant. But the London populace took his guilt for granted, and anti-Semitism ran hot in the pubs. Possibly Shakespeare was moved or commissioned to tap this mood by writing The Merchant of Venice, possibly 1596. He shared in some measure the feelings of his audience. He allowed Shylock to be represented as a comic character in slovenly dress and with a vast artificial nose. He rivaled Marlowe in bringing out the moneylender's hatred and greed. But he gave Shylock some lovable qualities that must have made the injudicious grieve, and he put into his mouth so bold a statement of the case for the Jews that competent critics still debate whether Shylock is pictured as more sinned against than sinning. Here, above all, Shakespeare showed his skill in weaving into one harmonious tapestry divers threads of story coming from the Orient and Italy, and he made the converted Jessica the recipient of such moonstruck poetry as only a spirit of supreme sensitivity could have conceived. For 5 years, Shakespeare gave himself chiefly to comedy. Perhaps he had learned that our harassed species reserves its richest rewards for those who can distract it with laughter or imagination. A Midsummer Night's Dream is powerful nonsense, only redeemed by Mendelssohn. All's Well That Ends Well is not salvaged by Helena. Much Ado About Nothing lives up to its title. Twelfth Night is bearable only because Viola makes a very handsome boy, and The Taming of the Shrew is boisterously incredible. Shrews are never tamed. All these plays were pot-boilers, sops to the groundlings, ways of keeping the herd in the pit and the wolf from the door. But with the 2 parts of Henry IV, 1597 to 98, the great magician rose again to mastery and mingled clowns and princes, Falstaff and Pistol, Hotspur and Prince Hal, with a success that would have given Sydney pause. London relished this serving of royal history garnished with rogues and tarts. Shakespeare carried on with Henry V, 1599, at once moving and amusing his audience with dying Falstaff's babbling o' green fields, rousing it with the fanfare of Agincourt, and delighting it with the bilingual courtship of Princess Kate by the invincible king. If we may believe Rowe, the Queen was not content to let Falstaff rest. She bade his creator revive him and show him in love. And John Dennis, 1702, relating the same story, adds that Elizabeth desired the miracle to be accomplished in 2 weeks. If all this be true, The Merry Wives of Windsor was an astonishing tour de farce. For though the play is noisy with slapstick and punctured with puns, it has Falstaff at the height of his verve until he is cast into the river in a hamper of wash. The Queen, we are told, was pleased. It is startling to find a dramatist capable of producing in one season, possibly 1599 to 1600, such nugatory nonsense as this, and then so ethereal an idyll as You Like It. Perhaps because it took a lead from Lodge's novel Rosalind, 1590, the play has a music of refinement in it, still hobbled with arid badinage, but tender and delicate in feeling, gay and elegant in speech. What pretty friendship is here between Celia and Rosalind, and Orlando carving Rosalind's name into the bark of trees, hanging odes upon hawthorns and elegies on brambles. What of Fortunatus's fund of eloquence spilling immortal phrases on every page, and songs that have been welcome on a million lips. Under the greenwood tree, blow, blow, thou winter wind, it was a lover and his lass. The whole outpour is such delectable foolery and sentiment as cannot be matched in any literature. But amid this cornucopia of sweets, Monsieur Melancholy Jaques mingles some bitter fruit, announcing that life's wide and universal theatre presents more woeful pageants than do the scene we play upon the boards, that nothing is certain except death, usually after a toothless, eyeless, tasteless old age. And so from hour to hour we ripe and ripe, and then from hour to hour we rot and rot, and thereby hangs a tale. So the Swan of Avon warned us that As You Like It was the swan song of his gaiety, and that thereafter, till further notice, he proposed to flay the surface of life and show us its bloody reality. Now he would open his vein of tragedy and mingle gall with his ambrosia. In 1579, Sir Thomas North's Plutarch exposed a treasure trove of drama. Shakespeare took 3 of the lives and molded them into the tragedy of Julius Caesar, possibly 1599. He found North's translation so spirited that he appropriated several passages word for word, merely measuring the prose into blank verse. However, the speech of Antony over Caesar's corpse was the poet's own invention, a masterpiece of oratory and subtlety, and the sole defense he allows to Caesar. His admiration for Southampton, Pembroke, and the young Essex may have moved him to see the assassination from the standpoint of endangered and conspiring aristocrats. So Brutus becomes the center of the play. We, who have Mommsen's details as to the odorous corruption of the democracy that Caesar overthrew, are more inclined to sympathize with Caesar, and are taken aback to find the title character dead at the outset of Act 3. The past is helpless in the hands of the present, which repeatedly remolds it to the hour's whim. In writing Hamlet, possibly 1600, as in Julius Caesar, Shakespeare had the aid and challenge of an earlier play on the theme. A Hamlet had been performed in London only 6 years before. We do not know how much he took from that lost tragedy, or from François de Belforest's Histoire Tragique, 1576, or from the Historia Danica, 1514, of the Danish historian Saxo Grammaticus. Nor can we say if Shakespeare read Of the Diseases of Melancholy, the recent English translation of a French medical work by Durant. Doubting stoically every attempt to turn the plays into autobiography, we are yet warranted in asking whether some personal grief, in addition to the sobering of time, entered into the pessimism that cried out in Hamlet and grew bitterer in succeeding plays. It might have been a second disillusionment with love. Was it the first arrest of Essex, June 5, 1600, or the collapse of Essex's revolt, the arrest of Essex and Southampton, the execution of Essex, February 25, 1601? Presumably these events moved the sensitive poet who had so warmly praised Essex in the prologue to the last act of Henry V, and, in the dedication to Lucrece, had pledged himself to Southampton forever. In any case, Shakespeare's greatest plays were written during or after these calamities. They are subtler in plot, deeper in thought, more magnificent in language than their predecessors, but also they voice against life the bitterest reproaches in all literature. Hamlet's vacillating will and almost his noble and most sovereign reason are disordered by discovering the reality and the nearness of evil, and by feeding on the venom of revenge till he himself sinks to feelingless cruelty, and sends Ophelia not to a nunnery but to madness and death. In the end, the slaughter is general. Only Horatio survives, too simple to be mad. Meanwhile, Elizabeth too had found the final balm, and James VI of Scotland became James I of England. Soon after his accession, he confirmed and extended the privilege of Shakespeare's company, which became the King's Men. Shakespeare's plays were regularly performed before the king and met with ample royal encouragement. The 3 seasons between 1604 and 1607 brought the poet to the fullness of his genius and his bitterness. Othello, possibly 1604, is as powerful as it is incredible. The audience was moved to pity by the devotion and the death of Desdemona, and fascinated by the intelligent malignancy of Iago. But in picturing such unmixed and unmotivated evil in a man, Shakespeare fell into Marlowe's fault of monolithic characters, and even Othello, despite his union of generalship and stupidity, lacks that rich admixture of elements which makes Hamlet and Lear, Brutus and Antony human. Macbeth, possibly 1605, is a still more macabre contemplation of unmitigated evil. Shakespeare could cite Holinshead for the stark facts, but he made the story darker with his passionate disillusionment. The mood reached its nadir, the art its apogee, in King Lear, possibly 1606. The tale had been elaborated by Geoffrey of Monmouth, carried down by Holinshead, and lately staged by a now unknown dramatist in The True Chronicle of King Lear, 1605. Plots were common property. The earlier play had followed Holinshead in giving Lear a happy ending, through reunion with Cordelia and restoration to the throne. Shakespeare is apparently guilty of the king's madness and dethroned death, and he added the bloody blinding of Gloucester on the stage. Bitterness is the organ tone of the play. Lear bids fornication thrive and adultery increase, for I lack soldiers. All virtue in his darkened view is a front for lechery, all government is bribery, all history is humanity preying upon itself. He goes mad perceiving the profundity and the apparent victory of evil, and he sheds all faith in a sustaining providence. Antony and Cleopatra, possibly 1607, reaches lesser heights and depths. There is something nobler in Antony's defeat than in Lear's rage, something more believable and bearable in the Romans' infatuation with the Egyptian queen than in the Britons' unlikely cruelty to a daughter absurdly frank, and Cleopatra, cowardly in battle, is magnificent in suicide. Here, too, Shakespeare had previous plays to work on, and again he bettered them, renewing and brightening the oft-told tale with subtler analyses of character and the unwearied magic and sparkle of his speech. In Timon of Athens, possibly 1608, the pessimism is sardonic and unrelieved. Lear aims his shafts at women, but feels some tardy pity for mankind. The hero of Coriolanus, possibly 1608, despises the people as the fickle, sycophantic, brainless spawn of carelessness. But Timon denounces all, high or low, and curses civilization itself as having demoralized mankind. Plutarch in his Life of Antony had mentioned Timon as a famous misanthrope. Lucian had put him in a dialogue, and an English play had been written about him some 8 years before Shakespeare, with an unknown collaborator, took up the theme. Timon is an Athenian millionaire, surrounded by receptive, flattering friends. When he loses his money and sees his friends vanish overnight, he kicks the dust of civilization from his feet and retires, a jaquees in dour earnest, to a forest solitude, where, he hopes, he shall find the unkindest beasts more kinder than mankind. He wishes Alcibiades were a dog, that I might love thee something. He lives on roots, digs, finds gold. Friends appear again, he drives them off with lashing scorn. But when prostitutes come, he gives them gold on condition that they will infect as many men as possible with venereal disease. Consumptions sow in hollow bones of man, strike their sharp shins and mar men's spurring marriages. Crack the lawyer's voice, that he may never more false title plead, and sound his quillets, quibbles, shrilly. Whore the flamen, priest, that scolds against the quality of flesh, and not believes himself. Down with the nose, down with it flat, take the bridge quite away, and let the unscarred braggarts of the war derive some pain from you. Plague all, that your activity may defeat and quell the source of all erection. There's more gold. Do you damn others, and let this damn you. In an ecstasy of hatred, he bids nature cease to breed men, and hopes that vicious beasts may multiply to wipe out the human race. The excesses of this misanthropy make it seem unreal. We cannot believe that Shakespeare felt this ridiculous superiority to sinful men, this cowardly incapacity to stomach life. Such a reductio ad nauseam suggests that the disease was purging itself, and that Shakespeare would soon smile again. 4. Artistry. How did a man of so little education come to write plays of such varied erudition? But it was not really erudition. In no field except psychology was it extensive or accurate. Shakespeare knew the Bible only so far as his boyhood studies might have opened it to him. His biblical references are incidental and ordinary. His classical learning was casual, careless, and apparently confined to translations. He knew most of the pagan deities, even the lesser or looser ones, but this knowledge could have been from the English version of Ovid's Metamorphoses. He made little errors that Bacon, for example, could never have made, called Theseus a duke, had Hector of the 11th century B.C. refer to Aristotle of the 3rd, and let a character in Coriolanus, 5th century B.C., quote Cato of the 1st. He had little French and less Italian. He had some knowledge of geography and gave his plays exotic locales from Scotland to Ephesus. But he gave Bohemia a seacoast, and he sent Valentine by sea from Verona to Milan, and Prospero from Milan in an ocean-going vessel. He took much of his Roman history from Plutarch, of his English history from Holland's Head and from earlier plays. He made historical faux pas unimportant to a dramatist, put a clock in Caesar's Rome, billiards in Cleopatra's Egypt. He wrote King John without mentioning Magna Carta, and Henry VIII without bothering about the Reformation. Again, we see the past changing with each present. In outline, the English historical plays are correct from our current view. In detail, they are untrustworthy. In standpoint, they are colored by patriotism. Joan of Arc in Shakespeare is merely a wanton witch. Nevertheless, many Englishmen, like Marlborough, confessed that most of their knowledge of English history came from Shakespeare's plays. Like other Elizabethan dramatists, Shakespeare used many legal terms, sometimes improperly. He could have gleaned them in the Inns of Court, the law schools in which 3 of his plays were staged, or in the several lawsuits engaged in by his father or himself. He is rich in musical terms and was evidently sensitive to music. Is it not strange that sheep's guts should hale souls out of men's bodies? He lovingly remembers the flowers of England, strings them on a rosary in the Winter's Tale, and decks Ophelia with them in her delirium. He alludes to 180 different plants. He was acquainted with the sports of the field and the points of a horse, but he had little interest in science, which was soon to fascinate Bacon. Like Bacon, he retained the Ptolemaic astronomy. At times, Sonnet 15, he seems to accept astrology, and he speaks of Romeo and Juliet as star-crossed lovers. But Edmund in Lear and Cassius in Julius Caesar vigorously reject it. The fault, dear Brutus, is not in our stars, but in ourselves, that we are underlings. All in all, the evidence indicates that Shakespeare had the incidental learning of a man of affairs too busy with acting, managing, and living to sink his head into books. He knew the more startling of Machiavelli's ideas. He referred to Rabelais. He borrowed from Montaigne, but it is unlikely that he read their works. Gonzalo's description of an ideal commonwealth is taken from Montaigne's essay on cannibals, and Caliban in the same play may be Shakespeare's satire on Montaigne's idealization of the American Indians. Whether the skepticism of Hamlet owed anything to Montaigne's genial doubts is an unsolved problem. The play was published in 1602, a year before the printing of Florio's translation, but Shakespeare knew Florio and may have seen the manuscript. Montaigne's subtle criticism of traditional ideas may have helped to deepen Shakespeare, but there is nothing in the Frenchman that corresponds to Hamlet's soliloquy, or to the bitter indictment of life in Lear, Coriolanus, Timon, and Macbeth. Shakespeare is Shakespeare, pilfering plots, passages, phrases, lines anywhere, and yet the most original, distinctive, creative writer of all time. The originality is in the language, the style, the imagination, the dramatic technique, the humor, the characters, and the philosophy. The language is the richest in all literature. 15,000 words, including the technical terms of heraldry, music, sports, and the professions, the dialects of the shires, the argot of the pavement, and 1,000 hurried or lazy inventions, occulted, unkennelled, fumitory, burnet, spurring. He relished words and explored the nooks and crannies of the language. He loved words in general, and poured them forth in frolicsome abandon. If he names a flower, he must go on to name a dozen. The words themselves are fragrant. He makes simple characters mouth polysyllabic circumlocutions. He plays jolly havoc with the grammar, turns nouns, adjectives, even adverbs into verbs, and verbs, adjectives, even pronouns into nouns. Gives a plural verb to a singular subject, or a singular verb to a plural subject. But there were as yet no grammars of English usage, no rules. Shakespeare wrote in haste and had no leisure to repent. The marvelous style, manneristic and baroque, has the faults of its lawless wealth. Phrases fancifully artificial or involved, far-fetched images, word plays tiresomely elaborate, puns amid tragedy, metaphors falling over one another in contradictory confusion, repetitions innumerable, sententious platitudes, and now and then hilarious nonsensical bombast filling the unlikeliest mouths. Doubtless a classical training would have chastened the style, silenced the double entendre. But then consider what we should have lost. Perhaps he was thinking of himself when he made Ferdinand describe Adriano as a man that hath a mint of phrases in his brain, one whom the music of his own vain tongue doth ravish like enchanting harmony. But, I protest, I love to hear him lie. From this mint issued an almost universal currency of phrases. The winter of our discontent, piping time of peace, wish father to the thought, tell the truth and shame the devil. Sits the wind in that corner, uneasy lies the head that wears a crown. Paint the lily. One touch of nature makes the whole world kin. What fools these mortals be! The devil can quote scripture to his purpose. Midsummer madness. The course of true love never did run smooth. Wear my heart upon my sleeve. Every inch is a hint to stop. And of metaphors another 1,000, of which one may serve. To see the sails conceive and grow big-bellied with wanton wind. And entire passages now almost as familiar as the phrases. Ophelia's disordered herbal of flowers, Antony over dead Caesar, Cleopatra dying, Lorenzo on the music of the spheres, and a whole repertoire of songs. Who is Sylvia? Hark, hark, the lark at heaven's gate sings. Take, oh take those lips away. Probably Shakespeare's audience came for his plumage as well as for his tale. The lunatic, the lover, and the poet are of imagination all compact. Shakespeare was two of these, and may have touched the third. He creates a world with every play, and not content, he fills imagined empires, woods, and heaths with childlike magic, scurrying fairies, awesome witches, and ghosts. His imagination makes his style, which thinks in images, turns all ideas into pictures, all abstractions into things felt or seen. Who but Shakespeare and Petrarch would have made Romeo, exiled from Verona, fume with envy that its cats and dogs might gaze on Juliet and he be disallowed? Who else, but Blake, would have made the banished Duke in As You Like It regret that he must live by hunting beasts so often more beautiful than man? Little wonder that a spirit so keen in every sense should have reacted passionately against the ugliness, greed, cruelty, lust, pain, and grief that seemed at times to dominate the panorama of the world. His originality is least in dramatic technique. As a man of the theatre, he knew the tricks of his trade. He began his plays with scenes or words calculated to jolt the attention of his nut-cracking, card-playing, ale-swilling, woman-ogling audience. He took full advantage of the abundant properties and machinery of the Elizabethan stage. He studied his fellow actors and created parts suitable to their physical and mental peculiarities. He used all the jugglery of disguises and recognitions, all the shifts of scenery and the complications of a play within a play. But in his craftsmanship, he shows some scars of haste. Sometimes the plot within the plot tears the tale in two. What has Gloucester's tragedy to do with Lear's? Almost all the stories turn on improbable coincidences, concealed identities, highly opportune revelations. We may reasonably be asked to make believe, in drama as in opera, for the sake of the story or the song, but an artist should reduce to a minimum the baseless fabric of his dream. Less important are the inconsistencies of time or character. Presumably, Shakespeare, thinking of rapid production, not of careful publication, judged that these flaws would pass unnoticed by an excited audience. Classical norms and modern taste alike condemn the violence that often dyes Shakespeare's stage. This was another concession to the pit and an effort to meet the competition of the slaughterhouse school of Elizabethan Jacobean dramatists. As he developed, Shakespeare redeemed the violence with humor and learned the difficult art of intensifying tragedy with comic relief. The early comedies are wit and humor unrelieved. The early historical plays are stodgy for lack of humor. In Henry IV, tragedy and comedy alternate but are not well integrated. In Hamlet, the integration is achieved. Sometimes the humor seems too broad. Sophocles and Racine would have turned up their classical noses at the jokes about human flatulence or equine micturition. An erotic quip now and then is more to the modern taste. Generally, Shakespeare's humor is good-natured, not the savage misanthropy of Swift. He felt that the world was better for a clown or two. He suffered fools patiently and emulated God in seeing little difference between them and world-explaining philosophers. His greatest clown rivals Hamlet as Shakespeare's supreme achievement in the creation of character, which is the supreme test of a dramatist. Richard II and Richard III, Hotspur and Wolsey, Gaunt and Gloucester, Brutus and Antony, rise out of the limbo of history into a second life. Not in Greek drama, not even in Balzac, are imagined persons so endowed with consistent character and vital force. Most real are those creations that only seem contradictory because of their complexity. Lear cruel and then tender, Hamlet thoughtful and impetuous, hesitant and brave. Sometimes the characters are too simple, Richard III merely villainy, Timon merely cynicism, Iago merely hate. Some of the women in Shakespeare seem plucked from the same mold. Beatrice and Rosalind, Cordelia and Desdemona, Miranda and Hermione, and lose reality, and then at times a few words make them live. So Ophelia, told by Hamlet that he had never loved her, answers without recrimination but with sad and moving simplicity, "I was the more deceived." Observation, feeling, empathy, astonishing receptivity of senses, penetrating perception, alert selection of significant and characteristic detail, tenacious remembering, come together to people this living city of dead or imagined souls. Play after play, these personae grow in reality, complexity, and depth, until, In Hamlet and Lear, the poet matures into a philosopher, and his dramas become the glowing vehicles of thought. 5. Philosophy. Hast any philosophy in thee, shepherd? So Touchstone asks Corin, and we ask Shakespeare. One of his confessed rivals gave a negative answer to the question, and we may accept that judgment as Bernard Shaw meant it, that there is no metaphysics in Shakespeare, no view as to the ultimate nature of reality, no theory of God. Shakespeare was too wise to think that a creature could analyze his creator, or that even his mind, poised on a moment of flesh, could comprehend the whole. There are more things in heaven and earth, Horatio, than are dreamt of in your philosophy. If he made a guess, he kept it to himself, and perhaps thereby proved himself a philosopher. He speaks with no reverence of professed philosophers, and doubts that any of them ever bore the toothache patiently. He laughs at logic and prefers imagination's light. He does not offer to solve the mysteries of life or mind, but he feels and visions them with an intensity that shames or deepens our hypotheses. He stands aside and watches the dogmatists destroy one another or disintegrate in the catalysis of time. He hides himself in his characters and is hard to find. We must beware of attributing an opinion to him unless it is expressed with some emphasis by at least two of his creations. He is at first sight more of a psychologist than a philosopher, but again not as a theorist, but rather as a mental photographer, catching the secret thoughts and symptomatic actions that reveal the nature of a man. However, he is no surface realist. Things do not happen, people do not speak in life as in his plays, but in the sum we feel that through these improbabilities and extravagances we are nearing the core of human instinct and thought. Shakespeare knows as well as Schopenhauer that reason panders will. He is quite Freudian in putting erotic ditties into the virgin mouth of the starved and crazed Ophelia, and he reaches beyond Freud to Dostoevsky in studying Macbeth and his worser half. If we interpret philosophy not as metaphysics, but as any large perspective of human affairs, as a generalized view not only of the cosmos and the mind, but as well of morals, politics, history, and faith, Shakespeare is a philosopher, profounder than Bacon, as Montaigne is deeper than Descartes. It is not form that makes philosophy. He recognizes the relativity of morals. There's nothing good or bad, but thinking makes it so, and our virtues lie in the interpretation of the time. He feels the puzzle of determinism. Some men are bad by heredity, wherein they are not guilty, since nature, character, cannot choose his origin. He knows the Thrasymachus theory of morals. Richard III holds that conscience is but a word that cowards use, devised at first to keep the strong in awe. Our strong arms be our conscience, swords our law. Richard II judges that they well deserve to have, that know the strongest and surest way to get. But both these Nietzscheans are brought to a sorry fate. Shakespeare notes, too, the feudal aristocratic ethic of honor and gives it many a noble phrase, but he deprecates, as in Hotspur, its bent toward pride and violence, defect of manners, want of self-government. In the end, his own ethic is one of Aristotelian measure and Stoic control. Measure and reason are the theme of Ulysses' speech, reproving Ajax and Achilles. Reason alone, however, is not enough. A Stoic fiber must strengthen it. Men must endure their going hence even as their coming hither. Ripeness is all. Death is forgivable if it comes after we have fulfilled ourselves. Shakespeare welcomes Epicurus, too, and admits no inherent contradiction between pleasure and wisdom. He snaps at the Puritans and makes the maid Maria tell Malvolio, "Go shake your ears," that is, "You're an ass." He is as lenient as a pope to sins of the flesh, and puts into the mad Lear's mouth a hilarious paean to copulation. His political philosophy is conservative. He knew the sufferings of the poor and made Lear voice them feelingly. A fisherman in Pericles, possibly 1609, notes that fishes live in the sea, As men do a land, the great ones eat up the little ones. I can compare our rich misers to nothing so fitly as to a whale. A plays and tumbles, driving the poor fry before him, and at last devours them all at a mouthful. Such whales have I heard on the land, who never leave gaping till they've swallowed the whole parish, church, steeple, bells, and all. Gonzalo, in The Tempest, dreams of an anarchistic communism where all things in common nature should produce, and there should be no laws, no magistrates, no labor, and no war. But Shakespeare smiles this utopia away as made impossible by the nature of man. Under every constitution, the whales will eat the fish. What was Shakespeare's religion? Here especially the search for his philosophy is difficult. He expresses through his characters almost every faith, and with such tolerance as must have made the Puritans think him an infidel. He quotes the Bible often and reverently, and lets Hamlet, supposedly skeptical, talk believingly of God, prayer, heaven, and hell. Shakespeare and his children were baptized according to Anglican rites. Some of his lines are vigorously Protestant. King John speaks of papal pardons as juggling witchcraft, and quite anticipates Henry VIII. No Italian priest shall tithe or toll in our dominions, but as we under heaven are supreme head, so under him that great supremacy, where we do reign, we will alone uphold. So tell the Pope all reverence set apart to him and his usurped authority. Though, of course, John goes to Canassa in the end. A later play, Henry VIII, only partly by Shakespeare, gives very favorable pictures of Henry and Cranmer, and ends with the eulogy of Elizabeth, all chief architects of the Reformation in England. There are some pro-Catholic touches, as in the sympathetic portrayal of Catherine of Aragon and Friar Lawrence, but the latter character had come to Shakespeare as formed in the novelle of Italian Catholics. Some faith in God survives throughout the tragedies. Lear in his bitterness thinks that, as flies to wanton boys are we to the gods, they kill us for their sport. But the gods are just, answers the good Edgar, and of our pleasant vices make instruments to plague us. And Hamlet affirms his faith in a divinity that doth shape our ends, rough hew them how we will. Despite this struggling faith in a providence that deals with us justly, there is, in Shakespeare's greatest plays, a spreading cloud of unbelief in life itself. Jaques sees in all the 7 ages of man nothing but slow ripening and fast rotting. We hear the same refrain in King John. Life is as tedious as a twice-told tale, vexing the dull ear of a drowsy man. And in Hamlet's scorn of the world, Fie on't, oh fie, 'tis an unweeded garden that grows to seed. Things rank and gross in nature possess it merely. And in Macbeth's, Out, out, brief candle, life's but a walking shadow, a poor player that struts and frets his hour upon the stage, and then is heard no more. It is a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. Does any sense of immortality soften this pessimism? Lorenzo, after describing to Jessica the music of the spheres, adds that such harmony is in immortal souls. Claudio, in Measure for Measure, visions an afterlife, but in somber terms of Dante's Inferno or Pluto's Hades. Ah, but to die and go we know not where, to lie in cold obstruction and to rot, this sensible warm motion to become a kneaded clod, and the delighted spirit to bathe in fiery floods, or to reside in thrilling region of thick-ribbed ice, to be imprisoned in the viewless winds, and blown with restless violence round about the pendant world. 'Tis too horrible. Hamlet speaks casually of the soul as immortal, but his soliloquy affirms no faith, and his dying words in the older version of the play, Heaven receive my soul, were changed by Shakespeare to read, The rest is silence. We cannot say with confidence how much of this pessimism came from the demands of tragic drama, and how much voiced Shakespeare's mood, but its repetition and emphasis suggest that it expressed the darker moments of his philosophy. The sole mitigation of it in these culminating plays is a hesitant recognition that amid the evils of this world there are blessings and delights, amid the villains many heroes and some saints. For every Iago a Desdemona, for every Goneril a Cordelia, for every Edmund an Edgar or a Kent. Even in Hamlet a fresh wind blows from Horatio's faithfulness and Ophelia's wistful tenderness. After the tired actor and playwright leaves the chaos and crowded loneliness of London for the green fields and parental consolations of his Stratford home, he will recapture the strong man's love of life. 6. Reconciliation. However, he had no obvious reason to complain of London. It had given him success, acclaim, and fortune. There are over 200 references to him, almost all favorable in the surviving literature of his time. In 1598, Francis Mears's Palladis Tamia, Wit's Treasury, listed Sidney, Spenser, Daniel, Drayton, Warner, Shakespeare, Marlowe, and Chapman, in that order, as England's leading authors, and ranked Shakespeare first among the dramatists. In that same year, Richard Barnfield, a rival poet, declared that Shakespeare's work, of which the best was yet to come, had already placed his name in fame's immortal book. He was popular even with his competitors. Drayton and Johnson and Burbage were among his closest friends, and though Johnson criticized his inflated style, his careless facility in composition, and his outrageous neglect of classic rules, it was Johnson who, in the first folio, rated Shakespeare above all other dramatists, ancient or modern, and judged him to be not of an age, but for all time. In the papers that Johnson left at his death, he wrote, "I loved the man, this side idolatry." Tradition joins Johnson with Shakespeare in the meetings of literary men at the Mermaid Tavern in Bread Street. Francis Beaumont, who knew them both, exclaimed, "What things have we seen done at the Mermaid? Heard words that have been so nimble and so full of subtle flame, as if that every one from whence they came had meant to put his whole wit in a jest, and had resolved to live a fool the rest of his dull life." And Thomas Fuller's Worthies of England, 1662, reported, "Many were the wit combats betwixt Shakespeare and Ben Jonson, which two I behold like a Spanish great galleon and an English man of war. Master Jonson, like the former, was built far higher in learning, solid but slow in his performances. Shakespeare, lesser in bulk but lighter in sailing, could turn with all tides, tack about, and take advantage of all winds by the quickness of his wit and invention." Aubrey, about 1680, continued the easily credible tradition of Shakespeare's very ready and pleasant smooth wit, and added that he was a handsome, well-shaped man, very good company. The only extant likenesses of him are the bust placed over his tomb in the Stratford church, and the engraving prefixed to the first folio. They agree well enough, showing a man half-bald, with moustache and, in the bust, beard, sharp nose and meditative eyes, but giving no sign of the flame that burns in the plays. Perhaps the plays mislead us about his character. They suggest a man of high-strung energy and passion, fluctuating between the summits of thought and poetry and the depths of melancholy and despair, while his contemporaries describe him as civil and honest, slow to take offense, of an open and free nature, enjoying life, careless of posterity, and showing a vein of practicality unbecoming a poet. Whether by thrift or gift, he was already rich enough in 1598 to join in financing the Globe Theatre, and in 1608 he and 6 others built the Blackfriars. His shares in these enterprises, added to his earnings as actor and playwright, gave him a substantial income, diversely estimated between £200 and £600 a year. The latter figure seems better able to explain his purchases of Stratford realty. He was wont, says Aubrey, to go to his native country once a year. Sometimes he stopped on the way at Oxford, where a John Davenant kept an inn. Sir William Davenant, poet laureate in 1637, liked to suggest that he was the unpremeditated result of Shakespeare's dalliance there. In 1597, the dramatist, for £60, bought New Place, the second-largest house in Stratford, but he continued to live in London. His father died in 1601, leaving him 2 houses in Henley Street, Stratford. A year later, for £320, he bought near the town 127 acres of land, which he probably leased to tenant farmers. In 1605, he bought for £440 a share in the prospective ecclesiastical tithes of Stratford and 3 other communities. While he was writing his greatest plays in London, he was known in Stratford chiefly as a successful businessman, frequently engaged in litigation about his properties and investments. His son Hamnet had died in 1596. In 1607, his daughter Susanna married John Hall, a prominent Stratford physician, and a year later she made the poet a grandfather. He had now new ties to draw him homeward. About 1610 he retired from London and the stage and moved into New Place. Apparently it was there that he composed Cymbeline, possibly 1609, The Winter's Tale, possibly 1610, and The Tempest, possibly 1611. 2 of these are of minor rank, but The Tempest shows Shakespeare still master of his powers. Here is Miranda, who at the outset reveals her nature when, seeing a shipwreck from the shore, she cries out, "Oh, I have suffered with those that I saw suffer." Here is Caliban, Shakespeare's answer to Rousseau. Here is Prospero, the kindly magician, surrendering the wand of his art and bidding his airy world a fond goodbye. There is an echo of the poet's melancholy in the undiminished eloquence of Prospero's lines. Our revels now are ended. These our actors, as I foretold you, were all spirits and are melted into air, into thin air. And, like the baseless fabric of this vision, the cloud-capped towers, the gorgeous palaces, the solemn temples, the great globe itself, yea, all which it inherit, shall dissolve, and like this insubstantial pageant faded, leave not a rack behind. We are such stuff as dreams are made on, and our little life is rounded with a sleep. But this is not now the dominant mood. On the contrary, the play is Shakespeare relaxing, talking of brooks and flowers, singing songs like Full Fathom 5 and Where the Bee Sucks, There Suck I. And despite all cautious demurs, it is the aging poet who speaks through Prospero's farewell. Graves at my command have waked their sleepers, oped and let 'em forth by my so potent art. But this rough magic I here abjure. I'll break my staff, bury it certain fathoms in the earth, and deeper than did ever plummet sound, I'll drown my book. And perhaps it is Shakespeare again, rejoiced by his daughters and his grandchild, who cries out through Miranda, "Oh, wonder! How many goodly natures are there here! How beauteous mankind is! O brave new world that hath such people in it!" On February 10th, 1616, Judith married Thomas Quinney. On March 25th, Shakespeare made his will. He left his property to Susanna, £300 to Judith, small bequests to fellow actors, and his second-best bed to his estranged wife. Perhaps he had arranged with Susanna to take care of her mother. Anne Hathaway survived him by 7 years. In April, according to John Ward, vicar, 1662–81, of Stratford Church, Shakespeare, Drayton, and Ben Jonson had a merry party, and it seems drank too hard, for Shakespeare died of a fever there contracted. Death came on April 23, 1616. The body was buried under the chancel of the Stratford Church. Nearby on the floor, graved on a stone bearing no name, is an epitaph which local tradition ascribes to Shakespeare's hand. Good friend, for Jesus' sake forbear to dig the dust enclosed here. Blessed be the man that spares these stones, and cursed be he that moves my bones. 7. Post-Mortem. He had, so far as we know, taken no steps to have his plays published. The 16 that severally appeared in his lifetime were printed apparently without his cooperation, usually in quarto form, and in various degrees of textual corruption. Stirred by these piracies, two of his former associates, John Hemming and Henry Condell, issued in 1623 the first folio, containing in one tall volume of some 900 double-column pages the authoritative text of 36 of the plays. "We have but done an office to the dead," said the foreword, "without ambition either of self-profit or fame, only to keep the memory of so worthy a friend alive as was our Shakespeare." The volume could then be bought for £1. Each of the approximately 200 extant copies is now valued at £17,000, more highly than any book except Gutenberg's Bible. Shakespeare's reputation fluctuated curiously in time. Milton, 1630, praised "sweetest Shakespeare, fancy's child," but during the Puritan interval, when the theatres were closed, 1642–60, the fame of the bard faded. It revived with the Restoration. Sir John Suckling, in his Portrait by Van Dyck in the Frick Gallery, New York, holds the first folio open at Hamlet. Dryden, the oracle of the later 17th century, commended Shakespeare as having, of all modern and perhaps ancient poets, the largest and most comprehensive soul, always great when some great occasion is presented to him, but many times flat, insipid, his comic art degenerating into clenches, his serious swelling into bombast. John Evelyn noted in his diary, 1661, that the old plays disgust this refined age, since his Majesty's being so long abroad. That is, since Charles II and the returning royalists had brought to England the dramatic norms of France. Soon afterward, the Restoration Theatre produced the bawdiest dramas in modern literature. Shakespeare's plays were still performed, but usually in adaptation by Dryden, Otway, or other models of Restoration taste. The 18th century restored the plays to Shakespeare. Nicholas Rowe published, 1709, the first critical edition and the first biography. Pope and Johnson issued editions and commentaries. Betterton, Garrick, Kemble, and Mrs. Siddons made Shakespeare popular on the stage as never before, and Thomas Bowdler made his own name a verb by publishing, 1818, an expurgated version omitting parts which cannot with propriety be read aloud in a family. In the early 19th century, the Romantic movement took Shakespeare to its heart, and the superlatives of Coleridge, Hazlitt, De Quincey, and Lamb transformed him into a tribal god. France demurred. By 1700, its literary standards had been formed by Ronsard, Malherbe, and Boileau in the Latin tradition of order, logical form, polite taste, and rational control. It had adopted in Racine the classical rules of drama. It was disturbed by Shakespeare's windy wordplay, his bubbling torrent of phrases, his emotional storms, his coarse clowns, his mingling of comedy with tragedy. Voltaire, returning from England in 1729, brought with him some appreciation of Shakespeare, and first showed the French a few pearls which I found in his enormous dunghill. But when someone ranked the Englishman above Racine, Voltaire rose to the defense of France by calling Shakespeare an amiable barbarian. His Philosophical Dictionary, 1765, made some amends. In this same man there are passages which exalt the imagination and penetrate the heart. He reaches sublimity without having searched for it. Madame de Staël, 1804, Guizot, 1821, and Villemain, 1827, helped France to bear with Shakespeare. Finally, the translation of the plays into good French prose by Victor Hugo's son François won Shakespeare the respect of France, though never the devout admiration there accorded to Racine. The bard had a better press in Germany, where no native playwright contested the prize. It was Germany's first great dramatist, Gotthold Lessing, who in 1759 informed his countrymen that Shakespeare was superior to all other poets, ancient or modern, and Herder supported him. August von Schlegel, Ludwig Tieck and other leaders of the Romantic school raised the Shakespearean banner, and Goethe contributed an enthusiastic discussion of Hamlet in Wilhelm Meister, 1796. Shakespeare became popular on the German stage, and for a time German scholarship snatched the lead from England in the clarification of Shakespeare's life and plays. For those brought up in the aura of Shakespeare, an objective estimate or comparison is impossible. Only one who knows the language, the religion, the art, the customs, and the philosophy of the Periclean Greeks will feel the unequaled dignity of the Dionysian tragic drama, the stark simplicity and inexorable logic of its structure, its proud self-restraint in word and deed, the moving commentary of its choral chants, the high enterprise of seeing man in the perspective of his cosmic place and destiny. Only one who knows the French language and character and the background of the grand siècle can feel in the plays of Corneille and Racine not merely the majesty and music of their verse, but as well the heroic effort of reason to overspread emotion and impulse, the stoic adherence to difficult classic norms, the concentration of the drama into a few tense hours, summarizing and deciding lives. Only one who knows English in its Elizabethan fullness, who can ride with gusto the Elizabethan winds of rhetoric, lyric, and vituperation, who puts no bounds to the theatre's mirroring of nature and release of imagination, can bring to Shakespeare's plays their merited acceptance with open arms and heart. But such a man will tremble with delight at the splendor of their speech, and he will be moved to the depths of his spirit to follow and fathom their thought. These are the three epical gifts of the world's drama, and we must, despite our limitations, welcome them all to our deepening, thanking our heritage for Greek wisdom, French beauty, and Elizabethan life. But of course, Shakespeare is supreme.